Good afternoon and welcome everybody to this press conference. As you might know, among the activities of the World Economic Forum for Latin America, the B20 Organizing Committee delivered yesterday the preliminary recommendations for President Calderon and 9 members of his cabinet. The document presented detailed and very practical recommendations to each of the core thematic task forces that define the B20 agenda. This work exemplifies how robustly business leaders have engaged as global corporate citizens, working closely with other stakeholders on the task forces to address 7 of the most pressing global challenges. I applaud all of the representatives here today for their collaboration and the outcome of the work up to today. The World Economic Forum is very proud to be a partner in this endeavor, especially at a point in time when rebuilding trust and confidence in the global economy is more crucial than ever. To begin with this morning's press conference, I will introduce the panelists, after which each of them will provide a very brief description of the recommendations. Alejandro Ramirez is the CEO of Cinépolis Mexico. Daniel Servitje is the CEO of Grupo Bimbo Mexico and one of the co-chairs of Food Security. Andrew Steer, the Special Envoy for Climate Change from the World Bank Group, is in the Green Growth Task Force. Jeffrey George, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer and one of our Latin America meeting co-chairs in the Employment Task Force. Gabriela Hernandez, Chief Executive Officer of GE Mexico on improving transparency. Pierre Froidevaux, Chairman of the ICC Mexico on trade and investments. Carlos Slim Domit from Grupo Carso, Mexico on ICT and innovation. And Guillermo Ortiz, Chairman of the Board of Directors of Banorte Mexico, Financing for Growth and Development. Thank you, gentlemen. I will now like to invite Alejandro Ramirez, CEO of Cinépolis and President of the B20 Organizing Committee, to make his preliminary remarks.
Muchas gracias, Marisol. Muchas gracias a todos los miembros de la prensa que nos acompañan. Como recordarán, el pasado 18 de enero tuvimos la primera rueda de prensa del B20, donde se anunció la conformación de estos grupos de trabajo que posteriormente sesionaron por primera vez, digamos, en el marco de la reunión anual del Foro Económico Mundial en Davos. Hubo un desayuno ahí con el presidente Calderón y desde ahí los grupos de trabajo han estado trabajando los últimos 3 meses en la conformación de recomendaciones que el B20, que es la comunidad empresarial internacional, presentará a los jefes de Estado formalmente en la cumbre del G20 en los
The next 17th and 18th of July, we finally gave President Calderon preliminary recommendations of the G20 of the 7 work groups that today co-chairs and members of the work groups will be able to share the diagnostics of their work and some of the most important recommendations. And I believe that it's very important to point out that B20, despite having a very short time frame, was able to integrate these recommendations so that they can be ready 2 months before the summit of chiefs of state of G20, and that indeed will be able to be included in the formal work and then eventually in public policies adopted by the chiefs of state and the governments of G20. Additionally to this, and something that I'd like to point out, is that aside from the 7 thematic working groups that we will be able to see, we've been able to put together a work group to do follow-up and measure the impact and see how from now on what the impact that those recommendations are going to have in the formal work of the G20. There was a total of 153 chairmen, global world directors, and that participated. And we also had the participation of multilateral organizations, civil society, the academia. So it was a multi-sectoral effort that will be seen and reflected in the recommendations. Well, this was my introduction, and now I'd like to open the floor and give the floor to each one of the co-chairs of the working tables, and then we will ask Daniel Servitier to give his comments. Good afternoon. Well, this health security problem is something that is very important. We need to feed the growing population with better diets and in such a way in which we won't affect the environment. The goals of the group also require us to focus our attention on the small-scale producers. Aside from the focus of this group is also to address our recommendations towards a culture of assistance and subsidies to farmers so that they can become entrepreneurs, increase their productivity, reinvestment, and grow in their capacity. The principal recommendations have been grouped into 9 topics, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to refer to each one of them. And I just want to point out that by 2030, we require to increase the production of food by 50% and then do it with the same land and the same water that the world today is destined to produce this amount of food. And to achieve this, we definitely require to increase our investment in our land, and that's why we need to implement changes in public policies focused on developing this investment by the private sector, and also to create infrastructure, the necessary infrastructure in order to produce and distribute this in a more efficient way. We also have specific recommendations to mitigate the risk in the production and distribution of food. We have research proposals and on how to accelerate research development in this chain and take this to the hands of small producers and farmers. There is a very important aspect in developing countries, which is to modify and overcome obstacles, property rights that impede people from assuming as their own a piece of land and that can be reinvested and sustainably manage that land.
We also have recommendations, very clear recommendations related to the impact on biofuels and energy resources so as to eliminate subsidies and work on a full cycle and eliminate the mandate for subsidies and promote research and investigation in the second and third generation of fuels. And lastly, we seek for all of this to be done with a country-by-country strategy. If these large ideas and big ideas do not end up in programs and strategies in each country adapted to its own challenges, we will not succeed. Thank you.
Y pasamos ahora.
Thank you, Daniel. We now pass to the recommendations from the Working Group on Green Growth that Andrew Stier chaired.
Much indeed. We're a group of about 25 CEOs with some academics and also some multilateral organizations. We believe that green growth is absolutely vital for the future of humanity. We believe that green growth is about economic growth that creates jobs, that brings prosperity, but also does it in a way that is less polluting, better for people's health, promotes more technology, and can create a positive spiral of growth and green that can mutually reinforce each other. The main challenge is to get investment steered in the right way. So we have 3 recommendations that affect what incentives investors receive, and then we have 1 recommendation on technology and 1 on finance. With regard to the incentives, first, we believe that there needs to be free trade in environmental products. At the moment, there are very good technologies that currently are not being disseminated because there are import barriers or non-tariff barriers, so we have some recommendations on getting rid of those. Second, we recommend that fossil fuel subsidies should be eliminated. This is not easy to do, but almost all G20 countries have subsidies now encouraging the production and use of fossil fuels. We recommend that each country should prepare an action plan over the next 4 years to eliminate those. Now, this is not easy because sometimes the poor could be affected by higher energy prices, but other countries have figured out how to do that with special compensation to the poor, so one needs to do it carefully, but it does need to be done. Third, in terms of incentives, we recommend that there be a stable and reasonably high price on carbon established throughout the world. Again, this is not easy. Not every country needs to have a carbon tax. Not every country needs to have a cap and trade. But over time, there needs to be a price put on carbon, because if there's not, then we'll continue to invest in the old-fashioned way, and we will not be investing in green energy in particular. And a part of the price on carbon also relates to the need to reform carbon markets globally, and we have some recommendations for new mechanisms there. So those are the 3 recommendations in terms of moving the incentive structure. Then we have some recommendations on technologies. Governments do have roles in creating technologies, and we suggest that there should be pooled financing for very large, long-term technology investment. And we also make some recommendations for the kinds of policies that can encourage innovation. Finally, on finance, there is going to need to be a lot of money put into green growth investments. The vast majority of this will come from the private sector, but modest amounts of public money can be used to catalyze or leverage private investment. So we make a number of recommendations relating to new instruments that the public sector could use. There are some funds today which are doing very well, such as the $7 billion climate investment funds that can be scaled up. There is a green fund that's being designed that was really in many ways a Mexican creation at the time of the Cancun summit. And it's very, very important that that be put together in a way that allows a lot of flexibility in the instruments that it can use financially, including equity, guarantees, subordinated debt, and so on. So there's a lot that's going on, but at the moment it's not really adding up. We make some recommendations for some new initiatives here, but we also believe that there needs to be a standing group of financial specialists at a very, very senior level that monitors whether we are learning enough on finance. And so we're recommending that the G20 establishes a group that would monitor how much finance is going in to green financing, and would also seek to catalyze as much as possible so that we'll know whether or not we're making progress. What we need in this area is champions. We need political champions because this is not easy territory. And so we're really delighted that the government of Mexico under President Calderon is seizing this issue and really seeking to push it forward through the G20. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We'll now move to the recommendations of the Working Group on Labor, Unemployment. Jeffrey Jors.
Employment and unemployment really stretches across almost all of the different action areas and groups and task force that we've been working on. We've tried to put in really some imperatives before we got into the action, and what we mean by that is that when you look at trying to reduce unemployment, it is honorable, but at the same time, we have to look beyond just the small elements of it, of finding 2 jobs or 3 jobs and using those as case studies. So number 1, we said we must try to do things that are of scale, that truly make a difference, because in the OECD countries, you have about anywhere from 40 to 50 million people that are unemployed. So what we have to do is to try to tackle that. So scale is number 1. Number 2, while it's scale, we still want to make sure that we understand that local markets are very, labor markets are very local. So things must be locally adaptable. You must be able to take this and drive it in and have it sponsored by a mayor, by a governor, at the federal level supported, clearly, but being able to also do it at a local level. Additionally, all of that falls at the wayside if we are not accountable to it. So our group is going to try to put together actual targets that we will hold ourselves to and try to work with the business communities throughout the G20 to sign up for some of these. We have 5 recommendations. First recommendation is to increase and really work on infrastructure and creating the kind of infrastructure that allows business to grow in a sustainable way. Having governments sponsor the appropriate studies to talk about where the trade-offs are and where infrastructure can be made, where it will enhance employment and where it will create longer-term employment. Second, we must have a look at and implement structural labor and market reforms and policies. We must make it easier for companies to hire people. We must make it easier for companies to change, and we must make it easier for small companies to bring on additional employees. This is not at the cost of security. So we must balance the notion of security and reducing some of the regulation. Here in Mexico, the labor regulation is actually one of the older regulations within the G20. Number 3, we must grow small, medium-sized enterprises and innovative business models. In the OECD, 60 to 70% of all employment is generated by small, medium-sized enterprises. During the downturn, they were the ones that have been hurt the most, and the pipeline of small, medium-sized enterprises have declined as a result. Easier access to capital, easier regulation to start business, and being able to have failure not be so painful. Well, of course, there's a consequence to that, being able to really excite the notion of being an entrepreneur and starting business. Number 4 is to work in the collaboration of business and education. Coming together because business is talking about a misfit, skills mismatch, and the educators are saying, what do you want me to do? Action items like adopting schools, creating better programs that universities and technical schools will be working with the business community. Having government support those programs that are in the science, technology, engineering, and math skills, and actually creating more incentive to create more graduates in those programs. And number 4 is to strengthen and increase the number of internships and apprenticeships. Internships and apprenticeships, it goes after one of the biggest and most chronic problems, which is youth unemployment. The ability to reduce youth unemployment, which is anywhere from 2 to 3 times that of the national unemployment in OECD countries, is a major part of ensuring our future. Having companies stand up for and commit to, for example, a 20% increase in their use of internships. Additionally, have governments make it easier to do cross-border apprenticeships. Currently, the certifications for some of these apprenticeships are completely different by different countries. Bringing those together will allow a faster increase, a larger increase of apprenticeships. So those are our 5 recommendations.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Jeffrey. We'll now move to hear the recommendations from the Working Group on Transparency and Anti-Corruption. Gabriel Hernandez. Thank you, and good afternoon to each of you. First off, to emphasize the importance of these working groups, we have spent the last few months with recommendations made from the meeting in France, and under the leadership of Mexico and Alejandro specifically, we have met to work on these recommendations. This is a new engagement. We're doing so in the anticipation of the meeting in Los Cabos. The Working Group on Transparency and Anti-Corruption, I think it's obvious that this is an important issue, and both the public and private sector must attend to this. Obviously, a lack of transparency distorts competition. It works against investment and raises the price of services. This is not advantageous to any of us. All of the economies of the world have an important level of government purchasing. In Sweden, it's between 13 and 17%, and in developing countries, 30% of the GMP are government purchases. So it's critical that private enterprise, private initiatives, and government efforts be joined in this effort. I'll give you just a few examples in the 3 different areas in which we have worked. I'll emphasize that these are measures that must be applied both at the federal, national level, as well as locally. It's very important that federal governments, national governments must work for these efforts to be implemented, but also make sure that these are implemented at the local or subnational level. This is to ensure that prior to government contracting, government purchases, and during the period of contracting, these measures be respected. We divided strategies in those actions that the government must undertake, those that private enterprise must engage in, and those that must be done jointly. As to the first group, one of the recommendations for the G20 is that all government purchases having to do with credits offered by the government to companies which participate in government contract have to be a part of anti-corruption programs within our own companies. This will ensure that the processes be transparent. Also, that the competition be both open to private enterprise as well. And these are engagements that many of our own companies are doing to require all of the suppliers within our supply chain agree to clauses on transparency and anti-corruption. And this is also focused on small and medium-sized companies. These efforts cover training, codes of conduct, processes for multinational enterprises as well as medium and small companies. Another important aspect is that governments accept and carry out audits and reviews under the standards of the United Nations and the OECD to guarantee transparency, and that there be a great deal of participation from the business community in these audits. So, in short, these are some of the aspects that we've worked on. We consider this one to be the key working groups. I think it affects all of us, all these processes. If our processes of government contracting are not transparent, this will be to the detriment of civil society as well. Thank you. We now will hear on the working group on trade and investment.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I will share with you the communique from our group, the Task Force on Trade and Investment.
Contribution to global peace and prosperity. We should definitively not take this for granted, especially in the current adverse global economic environment in which protectionist pressures are on the rise. Furthermore, trade and investment could provide a much-needed debt-free stimulus toward economic growth. With this in mind, we call upon the G20 to take the following 6 recommendations into consideration. First, the G20 should make trade and investment a permanent item on its agenda. This could include periodic meetings of trade ministers in between the summits at head of state level and on ongoing dialogue between the G20 and business on these issues. The B20 stands ready to work with G20 Sherpas and trade ministers to develop a business-driven multilateral trade policy agenda. Second, the G20 should lead by example by rejecting measures that restrict trade and investment and promoting measures that enhance trade and investment. Business is very concerned that measures which restrict trade and investment continue to be imposed. We recommend strengthening the existing WTO, UNCTAD, OECD semi-annual monitoring and reporting on G20 trade and investment measures. This could be done by giving trade ministers meetings a mandate to review the semi-annual reports and the impact of these measures. the B20 would be pleased to contribute to the G20's review process in order to establish the most up-to-date assessment on trade and investment-related non-tariff measures and their impact. Third, the G20 should encourage progress in multilateral trade liberalization and rulemaking within the WTO. This could be achieved through alternative negotiating approaches, including plurilateral approaches and approaches focused on particular sectors such, for example, the Information Technology Agreement or the Agreement on Basic Telecommunication Services. These approaches should be pragmatic, result-oriented, consensus-based, transparent, as inclusive as possible, and lead to multilateral outcomes. An obvious area in which this approach should be tried is the liberalization of trade in services, and the number of WTO members, including G20 members, are already exploring such an approach. Fourth, the G20 should strive to realize a number of quick wins and hence support progress on specific items of the WTO negotiating agenda on a priority basis. These quick wins include concluding the negotiation on a multilateral agreement on trade facilitation, encouraging the implementation of trade-enhancing measures for least developed countries, for example, the phasing out of cotton subsidies, eliminating agriculture export subsidies, expanding the Information Technology Agreement, finalizing agreement on the transparency mechanism for PTAs, and completing the dispute settlement understanding review negotiation. Fifth, the G20 should reiterate its support for open cross-border investment as an essential contributor to growth, development, and job creation. In support of these objectives, the G20 should encourage a broad dialogue on emerging international investment issues, such as dispute settlement in international investment agreements, the rising importance of international investment by state-owned enterprises, and how public-private partnerships can contribute to break down barriers to investment. This should be done in partnership with international organizations such as the OECD, UNCTAD, and WTO, with a view to promoting mutual understanding among government and between government and business, and strengthening the framework of rules for international investment in the interest of all stakeholders. The G20 should ask this organization to produce a study of existing investment practices in G20 countries and their corollary economic impact. And six, the G20 should create a working group on investment to move forward this agenda and report back to the next G20 summit in Russia in 2013. In the meantime, G20 countries should refrain from imposing barriers to either outward or inward investment and ensure that foreign direct investment restrictions or reviews are limited to well-defined concerns and are applied in a transparent and non-discriminatory manner. The G20 should look at hard and soft barriers to acquisition-based FDI with a view to rolling them back to at least the level prior to 2008.
Muchas gracias, Pierre.
Pierre, thank you very much. We'll move then to the Information and Technology, Communications and Innovation Working Group. Thank you, Alejandro. Well, we had a very interesting process in the work of our group. And this is a group that is made up of all of the actors having to do with information and communication technology, content developers, social networks companies, hardware companies, software companies. This was a very integrated group in a group that is as representative and as integrated as that of communication technologies. We're living in a new era in which we see many new possibilities and opportunities. And within this new area, communication technologies are the neural networks that are going to make it possible for countries to be connected and inserted in this dynamic process. Throughout the various meetings that our working group had, we considered the points raised in the agendas of the previous meetings, and we incorporated into the 2012 agenda 3 key areas that we consider to be of importance. First is the social networks. Many of the challenges in our societies are because technologies have quickly moved on, and we need, through education, to be able to take advantage of these technologies. Medicine, health, through telemedicine, quick diagnostics, and remote consultations and diagnoses. In finance, personal finance has made it possible for there to be a new inclusion of new markets through mobile telephones and employment as well, both in the generation of new jobs as well as new companies that create a great many jobs, as well as in these service areas that are being developed. Much of the employment that has been lost from other traditional industries and traditional sectors of the economy. The integration of our project with the International Telecommunications Union broadband project has led us to work alongside that program. A second chapter of the agenda that we consider key is that technology and communications have to do with all of the groups that are present here. Many of the strategies, many of the goals and agenda items of other task groups will be made possible through technology and the participation of small and large businesses in terms of trade, in terms of the environment. These are technologies that were born as green technologies and will make it possible for many companies to care for the environment through the use of information technologies. The effort is underway to look for links with other working groups, and so that communication technologies can be a tool to facilitate many of the objectives proposed by those working groups as well. One chapter on innovation was created as well for a broader access to information technology will allow for new innovations in both the social spheres that were just mentioned, as well as in new areas in terms of applications, content development, and new ways of working. We think this will be one of the important keys and key areas. We also set up a follow-up process, firstly, to look for a link between our working group and other working groups, and secondly, to do a follow-up with the recommendations and the priorities that we are focused on with the new presidency under Alejandro from the B20. Information technologies, and one of the recommendations that we seek to make, require significant investments, not only in infrastructure and in providing the coverage that is necessary, but also investments in updating technology for this sector. So many recommendations are being made to governments to find the means to stimulate growth and investment in this sector specifically, and to be developing investments for new content and new applications. One recommendation is we need new and trustworthy information. A sector that grows in double digits and in some sectors triple digits annually. We must have updated information as quickly as possible and that is appropriate to each market, each country, and each sector that relates to information technology. Finally, we are working on the final detailed points for the agenda to be able to present it in Los Cabos. We've made great strides, as I commented, on recommendations that we hope to make. And our wish is to have very specific and concrete recommendations and processes for evaluating to be made at the Los Cabos meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. And finally, the work group on financing, growth, and development, Dr. Guillermo Ortiz. Thank you, Alejandro. Good afternoon. The fundamental issue for this work group was to seek how the financial sector can contribute better to the economic growth and welfare of the citizens. The first difficulty we found, obviously, was to shorten the topic. It was much too broad, so what we decided was to focus basically on two areas. First, the financial inclusion. And we have several recommendations that I will briefly mention. And the second topic is financing foreign trade. Under financial inclusion, this topic is fundamental. In the world today, we still have millions of people, 3 billion people, who still do not have access to financial services. And obviously, to the degree that this perpetuates, these people will have fewer opportunities. Therefore, the first recommendation has to do with how we can help bank all these people, finance all these people that do not have access to financial services. One of the first recommendations is closely linked to what Carlos Helin mentioned a few moments ago. With the new technologies, for example, the mobile bank through cell phones, there are countries in Africa that have jumped to this whole traditional banking process through the branches by using technology, mobile technology, the mobile banking. This is just one example. Obviously, on the part of the government, there are actions taken to facilitate the regulation, facilitate the entry of new players for banking. In Mexico, for example, we have more than 1,000 microfinance companies, and obviously not all will survive, but there are 1,000. And this tells us that there is a need for these financial services. The second recommendation, very briefly, has to do with financial education, which is fundamental. And I would like to highlight a point. There are several paragraphs. I would like to highlight one, which has to do to debit the super debt of the people, the indebtedness, and which is a reason why some of us are still undergoing the causes of the financial crisis that we're undergoing, and we hear about many families and homes that are indebted. And this responded in part to governmental measures, but also to the mismanagement of the banking financial system in some of the countries, which led to this indebtedness. And this, as financial centers, as banks, as financial institutions, our responsibility is to make sure that people do not incur excessive debt. The third point under inclusion has to do financing SMEs. This has already been touched upon. I would just like to mention that even in the medium-income countries, such as Mexico, Just as an example, in Mexico, according to the last IDB survey, only 20% of the companies, SMEs, have access to banking services, to financing. In Chile, the proportion is the opposite. 80% is for SMEs, and they do have access to financing. And so the issue is financing for SMEs. As an example, the government can help by using their statements, their balances, providing guarantees, so that the banks can absorb that additional risk. That is implied in loaning to SME. And the last has to do with financing foreign trade. As you know, the financing of foreign trade is the lubricant of commerce. It oils the wheels of commerce. Trade worldwide has grown at 2 or 3 times the nominal GDP, which we've had for decades. So it's crucial so that in this integrated world, the world economy can function. The issue here is that the regulators, in order to prevent the financial intermediaries to run into problems, we know all the issues of Basel III, etc. They have regulated matters of foreign trade, and this has led to notorious consequences and the reduction of flow of financing to, for example, Europe. These are technical aspects, and I will not enter into the details of the regulation, but the recommendation to the G20 is to be careful, caution. We must be careful that the financing to foreign trade does flow. And related to this, a recommendation that we gave Calderon was to seek President Calderon to make sure that the private sector participates in the evaluation of the impact of global regulation. Once again, to avoid a new financial crisis. And to seek to strengthen the capital of the bank, the liquidity, the leverage, all of this is good. But the point is that all of this regulation, all the accumulated regulation, to make sure it does not provoke undesired impact, which will also impact the financial flow worldwide. Thank you. And I think we're running out of time. We have 5 minutes just for a couple of questions from the press. Yes, go ahead. Alejandro, before asking the question, could you comment on the past course of the advocacy? Yes, I commented at the beginning. As I indicated in my introduction, we will have a work group that will provide follow-up in measuring the impact of the recommendations from the various work groups and the specific work carried out by the G20 and their policies adopted by the G20 governments. Yes, go ahead. I am Silvia Gaduño from Reforma newspaper. I'd like to know, you have already presented these recommendations to President Calderon. Could you give us more details regarding this meeting? How did you see the president? Was he receptive? Did he show any particular interest in any of the topics that you mentioned? And what secretaries participated yesterday? You mentioned 9. Could you tell us a little more about this? And what is the expectation for June and the summit at Los Cabos? Yes, perhaps somebody in the panel could complement. Feel welcome to do so. The president received the recommendations very well, with which is perhaps unusual to some heads of state. I participated in the G20 in France and Korea. And in France's case, not just used as an example, but President Francosi received the recommendations from the G20 the same day of the summit. So we could not introduce this into the formal work carried out by the G20. But President Calderon, this is the second time that he has met with the B20. The first was on the 21st in Davos, and yesterday here in Puerto Vallarta. And he has offered to continue dialogue. But the whole federal government of Mexico has opened the doors to us so that we can link with the other formal G20 working groups. So there were 9 secretaries of state present yesterday, the Secretary of Finance, of Economy, the Chancellor, the Agriculture, Energy, of Public Works, Agriculture, Communication, Transportation, and Labor. So we have the 9 ministers or secretaries of state, and this gives us a clear signal that the whole cabinet is working in the different thematic groups of the G20 is linked to the B20. And something I did not mention at the beginning is that this is the innovation of this B20 is that in all the work groups we had an observer present, a member of the federal government that served as a natural link for the work done by the G20. So I think the president has given us his full backing, and he has a genuine interest in that these recommendations actually influence the formal work carried out by the G20. And he is committed to send these recommendations to the other 20 heads of state and the other 5 that will be present as observers at the next meeting. Yes. I have an observation. In my past life as a public officer, I was in the G20 from the beginning, since '98, when it was formed after the Asian crisis. I had never seen such an interest on the part of the president of the G20 to become involved, to involve the private sector as now. In fact, in the previous G20s that I participated in, the private sector simply was not even there. Or if he was, it was on the margins. What is occurring during this stage of the G20 with the presidency by Mexico is very unusual, at least in my experience. Thank you, Guillermo. Yes, Gabriel and Jeffrey. Thank you. I would like to add a comment on the relevance of the inclusion of the private sector, which was evident after this financial crisis of 2008. There are critical topics we are not going to overcome unless it is tackled jointly. And this is very evident. I would like to highlight that the leadership by Mexico, the leadership by the president, and the appointment of Alejandro has an important role for this immersion, because this is true in the fora after the crisis, but now this is being done in anticipation. We're working very closely with the government and with the other governments so that it can become a reality. This is not simply another discourse, but the initiative of the private sector with the government can carry this out. It's no longer bilateral. It's a topic for the society, and we need to work together.
Intriguing and satisfying meetings that I've had of this sort. Not only were we held to task, and part of that was your responsibility, but sometimes when we are held to task and are asked to do things and revise things, you feel as though it's empty because what happens out of it is no one looked at it or read it. In this case, each of us went through similar to what we did now, and President Calderon on each topic had his own thoughts, referring to what was maybe his priorities, or why did you look at this, or how would this happen? So yes, you can do some of that at the meeting, but you can also tell that these are thoughts of work streams that have been in his mind, and he has looked at these documents prior to. So that gives at least me, and I'm sure others here, encouragement that there is going to be some tail to this. There's going to be some action that happens as a result of this.
Muy bien.
Very well. Any other questions on the part of the media, of the press? Excuse me. My question is, how are you going to make sure there is follow-up? In Mexico, there's going to be a change of government, very likely change of party. So how are you going to ensure that not only in Mexico, but in all the G20 countries, this is not just shelved, but that it actually is put into action? How are you as businessmen, or what are you as businessmen committed to do so that this is carried out? And what is your commitment with each government so that you can say, well, what Argentina is doing is not good, Mexico is not good, or what the U.S. is doing is not in agreement with the green growth? There are many countries that are not complying with many of the things that you are proposing. So as businessmen, what measures are you willing to take so that it's not just another Christmas wish? I think the key word here is continuity. And for this new work group of follow-up and impact is the Troy and the previous year, in the impact follow-up group, we have France, Mexico, and Russia, which are the organisms that presided the B20, but we also have the OECD. We have the World Economic Forum. We have McKinsey and Company that has been present in all last three B20s. And there are several chambers. The BDI in Germany, which is the Chamber of Commerce. We have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And we also have BEDEF, the French Chamber of Commerce. And from Australia, we have also, because Australia will be presiding B20 in 2014. So Australia has already been incorporated in this work group for impact follow-up. And there are some think tanks, such as in Mexico's case, the INCO, which is also helping. The idea is, then, that one of the recommendations from this work group to the Russian presidency will be that they maintain at least a percentage of the members of the work groups in the next B20 so that there can be a smooth transition and that it can be easier to provide continuity. And one of the other things we mentioned yesterday to the president was the creation of a dashboard, which we will have in the vertical axis and will contain all the B20 recommendations in the horizontal, all of the we'll also have like a traffic light where we'll have indicators in red, green, and yellow depending on the progress made and on the recommendations for each country. And something else that we're looking for from the impact follow-up group is to have a champer or a champion, that we could call it, for each country that will allow us to promote the topics in each of the G20 countries. But the dashboard is very powerful because no president would like to see many red lights. So I think it's going to be very important to provide follow-up and to see where anybody is lacking. Yes, Alejandra, I would also like to add that in the presentation for the work group that I participated in anti-corruption, but it's true of others as well, it was divided into what the government has to do and what the private institute has to do and what we do jointly. This is just an effort where you sit down as a private initiative and provide recommendations to the government, but it also has actions that we must carry out in the business sector to carry out and promote with our own resources and with our own abilities. So that is another key, I think, to the success so that we can promote these actions and they become a reality. Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much for accompanying us in this press conference. And congratulations to all the members of the work groups for your wonderful recommendations. Thank you.